Hello and welcome to the Core Reports Weekend Edition. We're going to talk about the continuing economic agenda for India. We have an incoming new government, which is, of course, a little different from the previous one, though the BJP does have a majority. But it does raise some questions about whether the economic agenda could change, but more importantly, from our point of view, what are the issues that we should stay focused on? What are the issues that we should maybe not get distracted from? And of course, how do we achieve some of the larger economic goals and growth agendas that we've always aspired to as a country? So to discuss all of this in the context of both opportunities and challenges, I have three guests, D K Joshi, Chief Economist of CRISIL, Yamini Aiyar, Public Policy Expert, and Shankkar Aiyar, well-known columnist and economic journalist. So let me start off very quickly and bring in DK here. DK, so CRISIL does the reports which look at economic outlook or provide an economic outlook on the medium term. I think you call it the growth marathon. So walk us through what you are presently looking at or have been highlighting, and we'll talk about the credit policy or what happened or didn't happen in a moment after that.
Well, I think we do medium-term projections for the economy, and I think we've used the Solo framework, which looks at the role of capital, the role of labor, and the role of efficiency in driving medium-term growth. And our forecast is 6.7% per annum till the end of this decade, which is actually not very different from what we achieved in the decade before the pandemic. India grew at 6.6% per annum. But the difference would be because the size of the economy has become larger. So even maintaining that growth rate yields compounding benefits for the economy. And I think the size of the economy will expand and per capita incomes will also rise if you manage to grow at this rate till the end of the decade. Now, very quickly on the drivers of this, what we find is that the 53% of this 6.7% growth will come from capital because investments have been the key driver of the economy. I mean, investment to GDP ratio is rising. And the public investments, the household investments, both have contributed to it. And I think there is a wait for private investment to become broad-based. But investments seem to be the key driver of growth over the medium run. The second driver is efficiency. And the third is the labor. Now, the contribution of efficiency is about 30% to this growth that we are projecting. And the reason is because if you build infrastructure, if you digitalize, and if you do some reforms, I think you get efficiency benefits out of that. Just to give you one quick example, I mean, if you build a road which is wider, the trucks will move faster on that. They'll be bigger in size. So you'll get some efficiency out of that. If you digitalize, then your choke points get reduced. For instance, I think you have fast tagging, so vehicles can move faster. And then if you have reforms like GST, then I think you remove the checkpoints, you've got rid of the octroi points, so that also reduces the choke point. So I think the point I'm making is that all these three things come together and promote efficiency in the system, which essentially means that with the same amount of labor and capital, you can produce more. Now, the contribution of labor to this growth is the least, 17%. And I think the reason for that is women's participation in labor force is very low. And I think there are the economy is more capital driven and automation, etc., are reducing the need for people in general to fire growth. So the contribution of labor, that's why continues to remain quite low, and I think is projected to remain low unless I think you take steps to improve that. So that's the broad medium term projection for the economy and the key drivers.
Right. Okay. So let me quickly get Yamini's views here. Then we'll come back to credit policy and, or rather, the monetary policy side of things. Yamini, your sense of what we are looking at as continuing agenda points from a broader economic standpoint.
Look, I think there is no question that the broad story of the formal economy is going to continue to grow in the way in which it has. I think over the last 5 years, we've seen a consistent and careful move towards fiscal consolidation despite COVID. And despite the government, the BJP led NDA projecting itself very much as welfarist. It was welfarist whilst actually prioritizing fiscal consolidation and capital expenditure. And I don't, and I think these factors together combine to create this sort of broad economic narrative of macroeconomic stability and steady growth, albeit not fast enough growth for what India needs. The real question that economic policy has to respond to is the critical economic issue that this election brought to the fore, which is that as the formal economy grows, its equalizing trickle down benefits are simply not translating into what the bulk of the Indian economy, the real economy, needs: stagnant real wages, agriculture producing the largest number of generating rather the largest number of jobs over the last 3 to 4 years, the decimation between demonetization, GST, and then COVID of the small, particularly, and to a degree, medium enterprises. All of this opens up very important questions about the structural nature of the Indian economy and raises questions about how economic policy can address this. But I suspect we are going to find there is a consensus on fiscal consolidation and growth for the formal economy. I don't think the structural pathways that have been carved out so far are going to see a dramatic change. And that's really the challenge now for the government. How do you, within these constraints, address and respond to messages from the voters?
Let me come back to the credit policy question first, and then before we roll back again. So the interest rates have not been changed. Globally, the interest rate cycle seems to be shifting. The European Central Bank has raised, and others might follow, or at least that's the feeling, which is the Federal Reserve. But India at this point is not raising. So in what way do we interpret that signal at this point?
Well, I think just to give you a global backdrop to it, I think when the pandemic struck, everybody cut rates. It was a synchronous rate cut cycle. Then, when inflation suddenly appeared and became a monster, everybody started raising interest rates, and that was also synchronous. But now, what we are seeing is that it's the end of the rate hike cycle, but the different countries are going to respond differently depending on their domestic conditions. It's not going to be a synchronous. We've already seen the two most connected parts of the world acting differently. US is talking of higher for longer, whereas Europe has already started cutting rates because their growth rate is anemic. Now, within that, I think when you look at India, India's inflation is not that big a problem right now, but the food inflation is, which is related to weather. Now, since growth momentum is strong, so the central bank has the policy space, so to say, to uh, to target 4% inflation. Earlier, the band is 2 to 6%, but I think it's a too wide a band. So now, since they have got an opportunity because of high growth, so they are focusing on inflation, in bringing inflation down to that medium-term target of 4%. So that is why my sense is they are going to remain in that position as long as it is possible, and we don't see a rate cut happening before October this year. And after the monsoons have played out, I think we'll have more clarity on how much the food inflation is going to go down. And actually, RBI today flagged that the inflation is gradually coming down, but there are a lot of domestic as well as global risks to food inflation. And even commodity prices have started rising. So they are all in a very cautious mode. I mean, globally as well as locally, I think the central banks would err on the side of caution. They don't want to take a chance again.
Right, but the factors of inflation, and you talked about food, I'm assuming are different in India compared to other countries. And within food, you talked about vegetables. Now, is that only linked to weather, or because it's been around for a while and consistently rising, isn't it?
Well, I think agriculture is very closely related to weather. I mean, unlike other segments of the economy. So I think it is the persistence of high food inflation is related to weather. I think if I take you back to 2022 when it started, I think the heat wave actually that reduced the wheat output, and after that I think the global shortage and several things played out. Today I think the problem is the most volatile component is vegetable. Vegetable is witnessing 27-28% inflation right now, and that has to do with weather. I think, see, the shock from food central banks typically ignore as transitory, but if the shock persists, and vegetable inflation shock, the food inflation shock has persisted for quite some time. So if food inflation remains high, it has 39% weight in the consumer price index. I think then there is the expectation of inflation becomes very elevated, and because these are the things that you buy on a daily basis, I mean vegetables, etc. So you have a perception that inflation is high, and that actually expectations begin to rise on inflation front. And also there is because of this there is a fear of it getting generalized. So I think central bank, that is why, is not going to ignore persistent high food inflation. It will have to respond, and the only tool it has is interest rates. So that is how it is playing out right now.
Okay, let me come back to the GDP growth figure that you had mentioned, DK. So you talked about capital investment and labor. Now, and labor, you said the contribution is low, which also links, I'm assuming, to what Yamini is saying about, let's say, jobs. How do you, I mean, what does your, let's say, projection tell you in terms of the overall labor to employment or unemployment at this point of time?
Well, I think it's the issue. I think we don't measure employment, unemployment in this framework. But the issue, as I said, is that you will have to improve the quality of labor so that it is able to participate in the growth process. And I think the quantity of labor is there. I mean, so you have highly skilled people, and you also have unemployable people. I think so you have to raise the unemployable people up so that they can participate in the growth process. I think there is a skill gap in the economy, but I think even in services, I think if you focus on health, education, childcare, etc., I think these are all women centric. In manufacturing, the focus on textiles, I think Bangladesh is a good story there, and focus on other labor intensive segments like food processing, which actually will help you tame food inflation also over the long run. So there is a scope to elevate the labor quality up. I think that happens through education and through skilling. I think if you do that, then contribution of labor to the growth will definitely be higher than what it is right now.
Okay, Shankkar, I'll come to you in a second. Yamini, the general sense of, I mean, we all obviously agree on this, that labor levels or the quality of labor has to improve, it has to become more productive, and will therefore contribute to higher growth or keep growth where it is today. So what's holding us back?
Well, first and foremost, at a policy level and at a political level, acknowledgement of the problem. I think part of the challenge, particularly in the last few years, has been a refusal to recognize that, in fact, we are on a twin path to the economy. There's a formal economy that has, in fact, been able to not just recover, but also partly gain from both the COVID crisis as well as, to a degree, GST. But it has had a shock impact. And the assumption, the policy tool was you formalize the economy through a butcher's knife, GST being a good example of that. So at one point, that was also offered as one of the reasons, rationales for demonetization, that digitization would play this role. But the pathway to formalization, I think, is a lot more complex, and it needs more engagement. Where we've really erred is in not knowing what the economy looks like today. We don't have a census. We suppressed large amounts of critical data, including the consumption expenditure survey. Right now, we only have unit level data where the argument is on poverty levels increasing or decreasing, which frankly is not the key issue. The key issue is, what does a consumption basket look like, and where are the points at which people are hurting, so that one can get a better understanding. The periodic labor force survey data gave us some indications of the extent to which we are seeing this reversal structural transformation with agriculture and self-employment generating jobs, recognizing the implications of that, and then also being open to learn from experimentation that is happening at the subnational level. So, for example, this attempt at free bus rides in states, what is it doing to the labor market? We need to carefully study this, engage with it, understand it, in order to see whether it's addressing the big challenge of female labor force participation, which will take us forward quite a bit. So, really, the first thing the government needs to do is to shed its intolerance towards data that may give it a slightly less than happy picture of what's been happening. Because minus that, where are the tools to make policy? How do we actually, the reality of climate change and successive heat waves, unexpected rain, is creating all sorts of uncertainties vis-a-vis agriculture, which is change. I mean, we've been solving this problem of inflation on the demand side by providing free ration, but increasingly government procurement of wheat this year is lower than it has been in the last 2 years. So once your stocks start going down, how are you going to be able to manage this buffer and add to that vegetables? So there has to be a much longer term planning process also of what the realities of climate change and global shocks are doing to the food basket and to food prices, and how do we find ways to insulate that?
Shankkar, good to see you here finally. So the broader question that we're trying to address is the continuing agenda items for the government that's coming in. What should we be focusing on, and what should we, keep sort of our eyes trained on, and also how do we maybe separate a little bit the medium to short term versus the long term? Broad question.
Well, what the government will do is vastly different from what they should do. So, having said that, let me say that uh, there's a whole Peter Drucker maxim which says that which you measure can be improved. If you don't measure labor participation, you don't measure consumption, you don't measure incomes, you don't measure employment. So you're actually drawing an elephant on the blackboard at most times. The census is one issue, but the last labor survey was probably 12 years back. The periodic labor force survey requires you to be a rocket scientist and an economist at the same time. I mean, you have to read through it 4 or 5 times to get some sense of what's going on. What does the PLFS say? The PLFS tells you that over 45% of the working age population is engaged in agriculture, which is living on 1/6 of the national income. That is all you need to know what's happening in the economy. I mean, this one statistic should make them wake up. So what do? You have to shift them to productive sectors. So how do you shift them? We don't have an active policy to skill, upskill, reskill. That's the thing. Do we know how many graduates we produce in this country? We don't know. We only know the number of people enrolled in colleges. So that is one issue. So we know 15 lakh engineers are graduating every year, but this is data that comes from the industry. Out of this 15 lakh engineers, how many were placed last year? How many are placed this year? So those are the questions. See, the thing is that you need a visibility of where the modern economy is headed. India's largest employer is the IT and services sector. India's largest exports is the IT services. Both are going to be and are being impacted by use of generative artificial intelligence. Have we heard anything from the government? I haven't.
Okay.
So the question is, Govind, that there is another elephant in the room is that, and DK made this point pertinently, that there is an issue of skills where there are jobs, the skilled people are not available, and where there are people, those jobs are not matching them. So I mean, the Chinese say half the world, half the sky is held up by women, and our women participation in labor workforce is pretty poor. So, and they are skilled. I mean, as of today, there are more women enrolled in colleges doing STEM courses. Uh, there was a move to increase the participation of women in government jobs through some reservations or something. I mean, this is a cultural and an economic issue. It is a political compulsion that is also an. And the other thing that I just wanted to park here, because I heard the discussion on consumption-based growth and capex-based growth. Fair enough, the government has to lead industrialization and investment through capex. But there is the other C, which is consumption, which in the GDP data is showing up at half the rate of GDP growth. So how do you prop up consumption? Consumption is at 4%, I think. DK may correct me if I'm wrong, in the final data of GDP, whereas GDP growth was 8%. Is this normal? I don't think so. So what do? You have to find ways to prop up the family budget so that there is consumption. How do you do that? You have to do more welfare. You have to create jobs. You have to create incomes. Sorry, I mean, that was a long monologue.
No, very useful, Shankkar, and I mean, sort of at the right points. So, DK, let me come back to data, and since Yamini has sort of pointed us in that direction, let's, spend some time, and then we'll at the end come back again to data and what the gaps are, in order to obviously improve the quality of policy making. So, you use GST as a proxy. And one of your recent columns also said that basically the quality of data that you're able to now glean, or the quality of insights that you're able to glean from GST data is improving. So walk us through that.
Well, I think GST is a destination-based tax. So I think, and it is available at the state level. The private consumption data is only available from national accounts at the national level. So it has the potential to capture consumption in some way or the other. It will not capture the entire consumption, maybe 67% of the consumption, because there are many items that are consumed which are outside the purview of GST. But still, I think it has the ability to give you state level insights. Now, the GST numbers have been very robust, and I think there are three reasons for that. One reason is obviously consumption. The other is your improving compliance, and the third is formalization of the economy, which leads to more tax collections under GST. So the numbers that you see have these three drivers. It's not easy to separate them out because tax collections are still stabilizing, but I think it can still give you some insights into how the consumption patterns are differing across states. I think for instance, the compensation cess tells you in which states the sin items are getting consumed more. Even coal is including in that, tobacco, etc., etc. So I think there are a number of insights that you get from GST, and I think as more GST data is made available, it can become an important high frequency indicator of how the economy is moving. We only have the aggregate GST by states right now.
Okay, and the question, of course, then is it a suitable proxy for everything else that we've just talked of? But we'll come back to that as well. Yamini, on fiscal federalism, I mean, finally, money has to be distributed to states. States have to spend. Of course, they collect taxes. What's your sense on where we are and the unfinished agenda?
We started off in this new political context with the BJP emerging as the dominant party back in 2014, with this narrative of cooperative, competitive federalism, planning commission that was seen as the sort of symbol of the worst tendencies of centralization that pervaded governance in India being dismantled, cooperative Niti Aayog with states at the helm of everything, the 14th Finance Commission that enhanced devolution. We ended this 10-year phase of single party dominance with a far more centralized governance architecture, fiscal governance architecture than we could have ever expected. Both the 14th and 15th Finance Commission attempt at enhancing devolution to 42% never actually paid out in real terms. Devolution to states as a percentage of gross tax revenue ranged within the 32 to 35% range. Centrally sponsored schemes saw a change in the fund sharing ratio, so more money from states was going into Government of India projects and agendas, but also GST, which was an interesting moment in fiscal federalism. On the one hand, it was the first coming together of states and centers, where states were willing to give up fiscal autonomy for collaborative decision making, but also meant that states did give up fiscal autonomy. So moving again in this kind of tension of coordination, cooperation with increased centralization, and a politics that in every which way sought to centralize fiscal decision making, which created a new site of political contestation over fiscal federalism, which I think is something new for India. And we didn't have the institutional space to negotiate it, and political trust between center and states, particularly as more and more states began to be represented by non-BJP formations, expanded a lot. This also came against the backdrop of the growing spatial inequality in India, right? Like, as the southern and western states seem to be doing far better and have been able to leverage economic growth and market liberalization better than the more populous and far poorer northern and eastern parts. Accepted principles of fraternal tax sharing, where richer states share in the lose money to the poorer northern states for equity, started getting frayed. And the real challenge as we went into this election was, if we come back with a more dominant single party dominance, with the BJP kind of achieving their 370, 370, 400, whatever it was that was being projected, how would we address this really critical issue? Where was the institutional space and the capacity and the appetite for genuine consensus building over these very critical issues? Because the spatial divergence of growth and inequity is not changing anytime soon, and the political context of delimitation, which is upon us shortly, would further add to the challenge that we confront. I think the one positive outcome, amongst others, of this election is the re-emergence of coalition. How the BJP chooses to read it, how Modi and Shah, who've never been in a political context where they are not dominant, choose to negotiate and collaborate are open questions. But the more visible presence of state parties in the formation of the coalition may help. The BJP had projected itself as pushing a one nation project, everything from GST to attempt to create more portability in ration to tariff standardization for power tariff standard. All of this was presented as this one nation project. Can we now see some holes in this one nation project to becoming a much more collaborative, consensus building, states' rights oriented one nation project? And the presence of state parties now in the government may help move us in this direction. The 16th Finance Commission is facing very difficult issues of fiscal federalism. It'll set the tone for how we negotiate these critical issues going forward. The presence of states and governments now, I think, will help address some of these difficulties.
So, Shankkar, if you were to look at some of the points that Yamini made, which is, let's say, I mean, or let me put it this way: if you were to look at the pros and cons of, let's say, centralization in resource management, resource distribution, and maybe other macroeconomic policy decisions, what would you say today has worked and not worked?
Well, when you have to roll out something like Jan Dhan, then it works. But when you have to redistribute taxes, then there are gaps. I mean, the fact that the North versus South debate came in was primarily because there is a trust. So the essential thing here is that the North-South debate came up only because there is a growing trust deficit between BJP ruled states and the non-BJP ruled states. And that is because I think the consultative process of the National Development Council or the Planning Commission or whatever the Niti Aayog platform was called, the Team India idea, all of them sort of faded. Some of it may have been due to COVID, but thereafter there has been very little follow-up. What is required is some kind of conversation between states, chief ministers, and on issues, best practices, all of that. I'm not very optimistic whether things would change in the future just because there are two parties in the coalition. I'm a little skeptical about that. Also because both Bihar and Andhra Pradesh are looking for special status category, and that is going to fall in the lap of Mr. Arvind Panagaria. I don't know how he's going to deal with that. The issue is also about how much money the center collects in different ways. One of the issues is cess and surcharge, which is not shared. So there is the issue of how resources are mobilized, how they are distributed, and how they are used. So there are pet projects and then there are pet projects. The fact that a state like Andhra Pradesh, 10 years or however much it is since the formation, doesn't have a state capital is an interesting thing. At least the Punjab, Haryana guys are sharing a capital. So there are many issues. I have a feeling that there needs to be a conversation, a peer group conversation between chief ministers The Niti Aayog, which has been sort of missing in action for the better part of 5 years now, may have to sort of step up and create some platform for the conversation. For instance, I'll give you a simple one. Every state has some kind of investment conference. Are they based on competitive merits? Can they collaborate? Why are all investments going to Tamil Nadu or to, to Karnataka? What are they doing differently? Can other states follow? What is the role of resource rich states? Can they create more institute stuff? Can they do plug and play investments? PSUs are there in all over the country. They have a land bank. Can the states access those land banks to do something? Those are all questions that need to be discussed. I think I am hopeful that there will be some conversation and some debate about these issues.
Right.
And
Okay.
maybe we'll have some solutions.
Yeah, so I mean, I had not included this in my original sort of list of items, but since you mentioned it, Shankkar, the government's role, or rather the government's desire to be in the business of doing business, which obviously accelerated in the last 5 years or so. Is that something you see changing for any reason, or you feel that there's enough wind in the sails for it to continue?
It's a compulsion, Govind. I mean, if the private sector is not stepping in with investment, the government will have to step in with the investment. If they're going to do capex through the public sector enterprises, the role of the public sector in the general economy is going to expand. I mean, leave aside all the other issues of expansionism, expanding state centralization and stuff. I mean, there is a issue with the quest for homogeneity in a heterogeneous country, but that's a separate issue. I'm saying that if the private sector, despite 8% or 7.5% GDP growth, is still hesitant. I mean, DK might correct me. I know there are some companies which are stepping up. There is certainly investment in some sectors, but is it? How much cash are they sitting on? That's the first question I would ask.
Okay, DK, do you want to come in on? Yeah, yes, Yamini, go ahead, and then DK.
Just very quickly, just to complement what Shankkar just said, I think the big puzzle of the formal economy is why is it after this massive push for capex, it hasn't been able to crowd in private investment? And I don't know that we have a good answer. There is also this looming question of why is it that we have near capture of the big non-tradable sectors with just a few, actually basically one company taking over the big infrastructure expansion of this country, and whether that is further undermining the competitive spirit of private capital and contributing to this complete puzzle of enhanced public expenditure not opening up greater we know why capacity utilization isn't increasing. That has a lot, I think, to do with demand problems, but there is a supply side issue here too, which we need to unpack more.
So, I mean, the question, Yamini, I'm just wondering, sports is not an area which too many people want to enter for a whole bunch of reasons. What do you do then?
It's the whole bunch of reasons that you need to get to know. Ultimately, you want some competition, and you do need to acknowledge that there are these whole bunch of reasons. Start unpacking those whole bunch of reasons beyond and ask why is it that there's been so much political capture there, and how do we infuse some sense of competitiveness in there?
Shankkar, do you agree about that? I mean, do you feel that everyone wants to jump into ports, even if assuming it was all level playing field and equal access?
Well, there's one thing to be faced is there are very few companies which is the kind of, let's say, skills required to navigate through the regulatory environment, the cholesterol that is still there, and the issues of the yo-yoing of policy papers. Uh, and certainly, there are very few companies with the kind of deep pockets that is necessary to do something in that. You see, infrastructure has a long and variable lag, as they would say in monetary policy on returns, and the cycles are there. Then some of the infrastructure play involves commodities, whether it's power or cement, and then how do you navigate that? The point that has to come out is there enough competitive bidding in when you put out
Got it.
new projects? Is there transparency on how roads are allocated? I mean, those are the questions. I mean, since the private sector is pretty quiet about it, I'm saying that either it's all kosher or they're just not talking about it.
Okay. DK, your view from a numbers and a macro point of view, as you look ahead, because we're talking about continuing economic agenda, the role of private sector in, let's say, stepping up to the table on investments and particularly large investments. How are you seeing it?
Well, it's not that private investment is not picking up. It's picking up, but not picking up fast enough. That's the first point I want to make. The second is that Yamini mentioned crowding in. I think crowding in has happened, but in only few segments. I mean, for instance, if government builds infrastructure, the demand for steel and demand for cement rises. I think that we have seen directly. The steel and cement firms are doing quite well. I mean, they are putting up capacity also. Uh, the Where PLI comes in is, I think it's helping electronics, and it is helping pharmaceutical segment also. Now, I think one should also remember, when you look at the private investment going ahead, the nature of private investment is also undergoing a change. I mean, there are legacy sectors and there are forward-looking sectors. So you will see greater incremental investments in the private sector in areas like electric vehicles, in areas like semiconductors, for instance, and I think and green energy related. So I think CRISIL's estimate was that about 17-18% of delta to the industrial investment by the private sector will be in these areas. So there is also a a shift taking place within private investment. Now, I think the private sector also, among other things, not only in India but in other parts of the world, also worries about the Chinese overcapacity. So they want to be clear on the tariff regime that is going likely to play out. If China has excess capacity, it's going to flood the markets everywhere. So that also is something that is in the mind of private investors. So and then I think finally the last point, the NCLT process has also taken some of the froth out of private investment. I mean, it's true that people are worried about losing their firms. I mean, if they don't pay the debt back. So that has also reduced the over investment that took place before the global financial crisis and even after the financial crisis. In both the cases, private investment turned into non-performing assets because it was too exuberant. I mean, that kind of froth is not there right now.
But DK, it's interesting that you talked about electric vehicles, and if you were to add, let's say, lithium-ion batteries to that, that's exactly what China is also doing, isn't it? Which is adding capacity in these new areas. So if we are doing that, and which we are doing, including, let's say, highly subsidized semiconductor investments, we are in a way trying to compete in areas where we don't necessarily have the strength.
Well, I think the point is, I mean, you have to build capacities in these areas going ahead. I mean, otherwise, I think you'll have nothing left. I mean, so even US, which is such a strong country, is giving through its Inflation Reduction Act, it's subsidizing production in these areas or investments in these areas. So I think these are essential and critical strategic sectors. So you will have to focus on them. And you'll have to incentivize these. There's no way about it. But I think the worry from China could be in areas like chemicals also, where I think there is a huge global market also. And the worry is that they could flood your country with, and imports from China are only rising. I mean, you look at the trade deficit with China, it is not coming down, it's only going up. So I think from that angle, I think there is, so I won't say that it's an unwanted concern from the private sector side. It is. I mean, so they want to be. Everybody wants clarity. I think the environment globally is extremely uncertain. The prediction of strong growth is there, but underneath that, there is so much turbulence. I think whether it is the tariff wars which are going on, whether it is the conflict in Russia, Ukraine. So when you take into account all these risks which are seething underneath, I think the private sector will be more cautious. I mean, with respect to several things. That's my view.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to sum up in very, very shortly. So to add to your point, DK, the pharmaceutical raw materials, 70% imported from China. 10 years ago, the National Security Advisor of India said that this is something that we should view as a strategic threat. The fact that we have to depend on China for APIs. and but the problem is cost, because India is not able to match, or Indian producers are not able to match, and areas where we could produce or once were producing, we've had to actually give up, or for whatever reason. Okay, I'm going to head to conclusions. Shankkar, let me begin with you. So the start point was the continuing agenda for the government, incoming government. We were splitting it up in two ways. We said what are the longer term challenges, objectives, and the shorter term. I think the shorter term we've sort of covered very quickly, more or less, but if you want to come back, you can on that. And tell us about where you feel the top one or two, or maybe two or three priorities should be, and also what could be the challenges in an economic context.
I don't have a long wish list, Govind. I just have one line wish list, which is there are gaps in the delivery of governance in basic services, and there is a gap in the competitiveness of Indian industry, Indian businesses vis-a-vis other parts of the world. A large part of this gap is the delta of governance, which is basically how your architecture of governance is made. If you have 90 clearances for power projects, 110 clearances for hotels, and you have a high cost of capital, high cost of power, all. So basically, what we need is a system for a plan for administrative reforms. B, I think a plan for reintroducing some equity in the system so that we have more skilled people, investment in human capital and stuff like that. And C, I think that you have to build confidence, trust in the system for people to come up and do things.
Okay, Yamini.
Well, I mean, the most important thing in the short term, which is going to help us in the long term, is getting our data right. So let's get to know what's happening so that we can acknowledge the problem and plan.
So, Yamini,
sensibly.
if I may interject there. So, can I also ask you to add, let's say, what would be the three most critical data points that you would want, assuming, if, let's say, the government could not, for whatever reason, including census, of course, what would those data points be that you would look for in order to frame your own approach to policy making?
Well, I think it's really important to get a better handle on consumption, what the full consumption basket looks like, what employment patterns look like. We have some sense of it, of course, from PLFS, but how do we map it onto what household assets look like and income looks like, and more frequent data to be available on the implications of the fiscal spend on welfare. So the cash transfers, and whether that is genuinely creating a consumption floor or whether that is only a very limited contribution into the household consumption basket, and that will help us design welfare in a more sensible way. The second element of this is investments in human capital. In the long run, India will have to respond to global shifts. Whilst we need low-skill manufacturing to address the jobs crisis of today, we have to prepare for the future. We can't do it accidentally like we have done for the last 30 years, where services, there was ground prepared and we were able to propel into services. We have to now do it systematically and sensibly, and that means investing in human capital, particularly in secondary and higher education, linked to skills, but also linked to the future issues, and linked to that, therefore, is more spend, frankly, on R&D. Our R&D spend is far too small for where we need to be if we want to have if we want to be globally competitive going forward.
Okay, DK, last word. Challenges, opportunities.
Well, I think let me just add one point on the sustainable growth, because I think there are two parts to it. One is adapting to climate change, and the other is taking steps to reduce the emissions, which is a long-term project. But given that frequency of heat waves is only increasing, given that monsoon patterns are changing, I think it's bound to have an impact on agriculture. Even when the heat goes up, even the pest attacks increase because their metabolism goes up. So I think you need to have more crops which are resistant to these patterns. You need early warning systems so that the more and more of them, so that the industrial loss is also, or loss to human lives, to industry, is minimized going ahead. I think this adaptation part will be very critical because it is right here. I mean, so you have to fight it out very quickly. the emissions part, I think it's a unique challenge for India. India has to decarbonize while it grows fast, which no other country has done, I think, in at least in the after the Industrial Revolution. Here, I think how you do it, I think we've already backloaded our greening part, so I think we have some space to utilize the sources that we have, but I think we need a more focused strategy, so to say, on how we are going to reduce emissions, particularly industrial emissions.
Right. D K Joshi, Yamini Aiyar, and Shankkar Aiyar, thank you so much for joining me on our discussion on the continuing economic agenda items, both challenges and opportunities. Thank you so much.